Thank you for that introduction, Jess. Good morning. My name's Elaine Proctor, and I'm going to talk about why we tell stories. As a companion to my speech, you'll see the photographs of the great Henri Cartier-Bresson, whose work exemplified the idea that you could tell an entire story in a single image. So like the universe, all stories start with a big bang, where the material that will become the story is made out of nothing. A big bang happens in the writer too, each time a book is born. And I'm going to tell you about mine. Is that okay? Good. It was hot. It was always hot in the Namibian desert, but the rain the night before had made it much more so. We had a very strict rule on our film set of some 120 professionals and a small clutch of our children, that in all our waking hours, we were required to wear shoes, especially the children. So that morning, my very young daughter strapped on her sturdy sandals and so could run along the path to see the horses in the desert paddock. The previous day, she had met the herd of elephants that had arrived to act in the film. And this morning, wonder of wonders, she would get to stroke a newborn foal. I'm told that she sang at the top of her voice as she ran along the path, ahead of everyone else. The cobra bit her twice on the ankle. And as my assistant director drove me the infinitely long 20 or so kilometers to the clinic where she lay, I didn't know whether she was alive or dead. It was like being burned in a fire. And here's the thing that I thought I knew but didn't about story and its genesis and its origins. I thought that I would then, in time, write a story about a snake and a little girl. But I couldn't. Something else had crept into the space hollowed out by that trauma, and it really began with a question, which was very simple. What do people do when bad things happen and they can't get away? What about the mothers and the children who do not have the luxury of a gentle recovery? And that question remained really in the calm pools of my life, uselessly, I thought. Until one day I was driving in Italy along a road and I passed a lay-by hacked out of the brush on the side of the road, and in it stood an African woman. She was very provocatively dressed, and she held an umbrella over her head to protect her from the sun. She was a prostitute. And there it was. What had begun with my big bang in Namibia joined forces with the image of this young woman standing in the dust and became a story. Of course, I had to learn her world, or rather her imagined world, in order to tell that story. I spent months and months of time doing research. I lived with a Congolese family. And most weekends, I went to Le Pitch, which is a spectacular gathering of Congolese immigrants, both recent and more established, that takes place at the Broadwater Farm housing estate in Tottenham. And it was at Le Pitch that I really learned that music and dance and food and friends and the spectacular Congolese sapeurs and their designer attire taught me that, as the writer Chimamanda Adichie would say, there is never a single story, that suffering and joy are partners, always. It was at Le Pitch that I first imagined the 10-year-old hero of my book, whose name is Flambeau, who could well have been the son of the woman standing in the dust. And it was at Le Pitch that I really understood that the story really had to tell about Flambeau's quest to find his mother and save her from enslavement by people traffickers. So you see, I hope that my desert event with the snake and my daughter is no longer an alien drama to you. The story's made you part of it. And we together have met the woman in the truck stop who we knew nothing about this morning. Story ends our isolation in the universe, because we see with such surprise that the personal experience of complete strangers, when they become story, binds us to them. It was a very hard book to write. Actually, having just delivered my new book, or a draft of it, I realized that they all are and forever will be. But I have a few quotes up in my office that get me through the darkest hours. And this one is from Mark Twain. And it reads, "It's the job of the writer to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable." And I realize it's my own comfort that must be disturbed for the next big bang to become visible to me. Of late, a different kind of disquiet has attended the labor of many writers that I talk to. We have goosebumps, actually, and they come really from an increasing sense of the disjuncture between the long, slow, solitary labor that we know produces thoughtful stories and the raucous, internet-driven communication that clatters through the airspace and rattles at our office doors with storytelling claims of its own. And just like you, I appreciate the power of social media, really to communicate forces for social change, to act as a platform for the distribution of material written elsewhere. I, like you, enjoy the immediacy of the Facebook messages. Well, here's me on the beach in Guadeloupe. Or your dear friend's picture of her mother when you realize that she has the same eyes. There's no question that we all have to negotiate the stormy seas of this digital revolution that we hope will make our world a more equitable place. And I have to confess, I really enjoy the brief, witty communications that are almost poetry that this kind of communication produces. But they're not story, not as I understand it. They are moment, and they speak only to part of who we are. The I have just seen it, or it just happened moment. We need to understand what social media is and what it is not. There have been many studies done recently, one by the University of Michigan and Leuven University in Belgium, where it was shown that really the more a person uses Facebook, the less satisfied they are with their life. And a survey done of people in their early 20s revealed that the emotion predominantly associated with Facebook is envy. And we do, don't we? We envy the perfect lives of our friends and acquaintances we see on Facebook. There's a recent YouTube film you may have seen by a young woman called Charlene de Guzman, in which she makes a lament, a damning commentary really, about how much of her young life is lived in isolation, while the people most intimately connected with her stare at their smartphones. What she's missing, really, is an ordinary and full connection with daily life, lived in communion with other people who through experience learn, don't learn, love, hate, nurture, devastate. This is what I mean by story. So I stand before you today and I say, damn, we're in a tight spot. And I feel exactly like the George Clooney character in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, the Coen brothers film, with his hairnet on and the Ku Klux Klan about to set him alight. Story's in a tight spot. And so are we, in a sense, as a culture. But before we get involved in whether your tweet, OMG, I just saw Miley Cyrus, hashtag, I never know where to put the hashtags. whether we wonder whether it's story, let's look in the opposite direction, because we know the archaeology of stories. We have a snapshot of the birth of a story from almost 4,000 years ago. And actually it could have been found in many ancient texts, but this one happens to come from the ancient Near Eastern tradition of the nomadic Jews. A cataclysmic story needed to be told about slavery in Egypt and liberation and escape through the sea. And so what do we find in this document we know as the Book of Exodus? Detailed description of how the story should be told. And it goes like this. When your children say unto you, what do you mean by this ritual? You shall say to them, it is the ritual of the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt, and he spared those houses. And so on. In the telling of these stories, the people who speak and the people who listen are joined together in community. This is how information is passed from generation to generation to generation. So your tweet, OMG, I just saw Miley Cyrus, is really your excitement at finding yourself part of a famous person's moment. But I would argue it's not your story. Your story is about inviting other people into your world and entering the world of others too. Your story, the ones you read and the ones you tell, will take you to those places. Your stories are broader, deeper, denser, richer than the architecture of social media has room for, at least at the moment. So don't let it limit what you say or how you say it. Your story is your story. Write it down, tell it to someone so it can be repeated in other places and at other times. James Wood is a literary critic of the New Yorker magazine, and he coined a beautiful phrase when he was writing about an American essayist. And I quote, he said, his talent for the real, or for the real fictions people make of the real and by which they live, the really real. And by that I think he meant that all good story originates in the really real. The real of your lives, the real of the fleeing Hebrew slaves, the real of the woman in the truck stop. It helps us to pay attention to life as we live it, and then through story to give you the chance to live it too. One of the sacred rules of good storytelling is to show, not tell. And of course, rules are always there to be broken, but understood first, I think. If we tell, we insist that you, the reader, understand a moment or an event or a narrative change exactly as we, the writer, understands it. We declaim its meaning for you, but if we show, we give you specific details. The sun, the heat, the sandals, the snake, the woman, the umbrella. We give you the space to wonder, where does she come from? Is she hot? Where are her children? Is she thirsty? We respect your right to make your own sense of what you've read. And beyond that even, we invite you to go way beyond the wisdom of the writer and to make your own relationship contemplative and critical with what you have read. As readers and as writers, we must surely respond to what Seamus Heaney calls the claims of the Republic of Conscience. And we must write about people in extremis in Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, the Congo, Somalia, and indeed in London. But even then, when we are attending to lives like that, there is no causal relationship between an event and its story. How we write and what we write about is a much more mysterious process. I certainly didn't know it at the time, but I've come to understand that my new book is really my way of asking forgiveness from my mother, who has dementia, for not being able to do more to stop the decline of this intelligent woman into a life without story. It was at this very school that I heard the great poet Paul Muldoon say these words. He said, "It is only, I think, when you open yourself to forces greater than yourself, in this case, the power of the language to make connections, and today, between me and you and the snake and the woman and my mother and life and death and love, that something truly interesting will happen. So tell your stories. Paint them, write them, photograph them, sing them. Do it long and do it with an open heart, and your stories will propel you towards a deeper understanding of who you are, of your world and the worlds of others. The best stories take you by the hand and say, I have something infinitely precious to show you. And I hope for you that you will say, I have something to show you too.